Okay, thank you.
Okay, the meeting.
Time still restarting.
That's when we were fighting over that one.
Good evening and welcome to the special council meeting. Members of the public may watch or participate in this open meeting using any of the following methods. Attend the township office located at 2958 Greenfield Road, Dumfries Room. Watch the live stream by accessing the meeting on the township's YouTube page. Attend electronically to observe the meeting or to speak to an item on the agenda. To attend electronically, members of the public have been asked to register with the Clerk's Division in advance. And finally, you can submit written comments to the Clerk's Division that will be provided to the mayor and council prior to the meeting and will form part of the public record. I'd now like to call this meeting to order and ask for the approval of the agenda, please.
Moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Rowland that Council adopt the June 6, 2022 special meeting council agenda as presented with the following addendum. 1. Add one piece of correspondence received for 6.1 PD report number 22-2022 discussion paper region of Waterloo draft land needs assessment 2021 to 2051 regional official plan review.
Thank you. All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Next, I'd like to do the territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mucho people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements and their contributions to our community. We offer this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. And now we'd like to pause for a few moments to reflect. Reflect on what has happened in the past. Reflect on what we can learn and do today, so together we can move for a better future. Thank you. Is there any disclosure of peculiar interest or general nature thereof? Seeing no hands, item for discussion, PD report 22-2022 discussion paper region of Waterloo draft land needs assessment 2021 to 2051 regional official plan review. Presentation from Andrew McNeely, Chief Administrative Officer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Tonight I have a brief PowerPoint presentation. Unfortunately, some elements of my original presentation were lost, transferring it to tonight's tablet, so there will be no mapping components. The meeting this evening is a special meeting of council and was called to provide council members of the public with an overview of work that's presently underway by the region of Waterloo related to the land needs assessment. And this is a ongoing exercise. Work that will be discussed tonight should be considered a work in progress as the region continues to refine their strategy, as they continue to hear comments from interested members of the public, community organizations, and technical advisors.
CEO McNeely, may I interrupt? The maps are on the agenda, correct?
There are attachments in the staff report that form part of the posted agenda on the website.
So, Ashley and can put those up for us, right? At the right time, if you want the maps. Is that correct?
Just because he's sharing his screen.
Okay, so you would have to stop sharing if you want the maps.
Yeah.
So you'll let her know if you want them. Okay.
Mhm.
Sorry, Perry.
So the purpose of our meeting tonight is to provide a forum in which we're going to provide an overview of the draft land needs assessment as prepared by the region of Waterloo in support of the region's official plan update. So in this respect, the township is like a commenting agency on work being undertaken by the region. We're going to explain the different growth options, both for residential and non-residential development, as set out in the document, which was released for public engagement by the region in April of 2022. We're going to provide some staff comments at certain points for the consideration of council as part of the region's engagement process. And we're going to suggest to council a preferred land use strategy for the township's consideration as part of the 22 to 2051 time horizon. It's important that we understand the context of where we are today and why we're going through this exercise. The province of Ontario, through various pieces of provincial policies, have assigned responsibility to upper tier municipalities. So in some cases that could be counties, and in our case, it's the region of Waterloo. They're assigned population and employment forecasts by the province for the planning horizon. And for the purposes of this exercise, planning horizon is from the present time period through to 2051. This is the first time that we've actually taken a snapshot for a 30-year time horizon. Typically, our planning exercises have looked forward for a period of 20 years. So as individuals are looking at methodologies for employment and residential growth, no one really knows what transportation will look like, what technology will be as it may inform and change our land use dynamics. So we're trying to use the best information we have today and extrapolate that out for 3 decades forward. It's important to understand that generally speaking, every 10 years, the province publishes new employment and residential modeling, and we assume that they'll either look at a 20 or 30-year horizon going forward in each of those 10-year touch points. For Waterloo region, because we're within the greater Golden Horseshoe area, the growth projections that are utilized by the region are from the growth plan. And as I mentioned, they are issued through the province. The province has also established a methodology that the region is to utilize to assess the quantity of land to accommodate growth through to the 2051 time horizon. And as part of that overall analysis, the region, as part of their land budget needs, and looking at both employment and residential needs, have to identify targets for intensification opportunities within existing built-up areas of the 7 area municipalities. They have to look for opportunities where there may be an opportunity for conversion of either functionally obsolete lands and or buildings as a redevelopment scenario, whether it be for employment or residential purposes. Lands that are designated for development that are presently vacant. So as an example, if you look at South Air along the Grant Waterloo corridor, east of Swan Street, we have designated greenfield lands that have draft plan approval, but a portion of those lands are presently vacant in that they do not have homes on them. And then they have to look at and identify density thresholds for future greenfield development and how much growth can be accommodated within that greenfield development, both existing and potentially future. So at a very, very high level, the province has identified the Waterloo region by 2051 will continue to grow, and they forecast the following by 2051. Population of 923,000 persons. Just to give you a context, our present population as of 2021 is 617,000 thousand persons. So effectively, we're looking at an increase of about 1/3 of our existing population being added over the next 30-year time horizon. Companion to that residential growth, there's employment-related positions targeted of approximately 177,000 persons over that 30-year time horizon. The draft land needs assessment that's presently underway is a very important step in determining the region and how it will allocate and accommodate projected population and employment growth for the next 30-year time horizon. The draft land needs assessment is an actual document that's approved by the region of Waterloo Council. So Township Council, just like it will be in the other area municipalities, community groups and organizations, individual residents, we are all providing comments back to regional council to assist them as part of their broader decision-making responsibility. But ultimately, it will be the region that will determine the land budget assigned to each of the 7 area municipalities, the overall density targets. And if we're looking at greenfield development and what the intensification rate would be in terms of direction of future growth within our built-up urban areas. As I mentioned, the draft land needs assessment should be considered a work in progress. The region continues to refine and rework the growth methodologies and the land budget assignments for each of the 7 area municipalities. It is also staff's understanding that in the next few days, the region will be presenting 2 other reports for release to the public and area municipalities. They'll be related to greenhouse gas emissions and modeling for each of the growth options, as well as a financial impact analysis that will look at the costs attributed to each of the growth models vis-a-vis regional cost centers, such as transit, expansions to water treatment plants, water pollution control plants, transit services, or upgrades to the regional surface transportation network. The land needs assessment and the update to the regional official plan, remembering that the land needs assessment gives that snapshot. The regional official plan is the policy document that speaks to the future, both by policy direction and land use designations and classifications. These 2 documents in partnership should be considered transformative in their nature as they establish the a strategy and a blueprint to guide development over the next 30-year time horizon. While there'll be touch points, as I mentioned, generally speaking, every 10 years, there'll be updated employment and residential forecasts. The change that would occur would be incremental in nature. The template or the philosophy of growth and its form and function will be established in the present time. There are a series of guiding principles or thematic areas that the region has utilized as part of their overall analysis to inform their growth models and their associated land budget allocations for both residential and non-residential growth for each of the 7 area municipalities. These principles to inform allocation of growth include creating or promoting the premise of compact and complete communities, the provision of a wide range of and mix of housing, including a range of housing that should be considered affordable, the protection of agricultural lands and key natural heritage features, the efficient use of infrastructure and facilities, and obviously, where possible, to leverage where those pieces of infrastructure or investments and facilities have already been made to maximize their potential. Climate change and how we can mitigate the increase in GHG emissions. Each of the 7 area municipalities, along with the region, have embraced the objectives of reducing our overall carbon footprint, both by 2031 and 2051 time horizons. consistent with the transformed WR document. And to encourage and promote a form of development that is supportive of transit, including those areas which today are not necessarily served by transit, but could be and should be in the future, as well as active transportation networks such as cycling corridors, pedestrian trails, and similar means and methods as an alternative to the vehicle. It's important to understand terms. Planners love jargon, and to try and provide some context in that, there will be some terminology that I'll be using in my presentation today. And it's important that everyone has a clear understanding of what these terms mean. Community areas, that's where essentially most of our housing, commercial, retail, and institutional growth will be located. So if I look at North Dumfries in isolation, the settlement area there would be a community area. We have a mix of land use activities to support both residential and employment opportunities. By contrast, the reference to employment areas are basically your industrial or business parks. They're very homogeneous in nature, and generally speaking, this is where you would find manufacturing, logistics, and warehouse type land use activities. Other terms that are used, both in provincial policy and the preparation of the draft land needs assessment, built up area or BUA, and essentially these are areas within existing settlements where development has previously occurred, and the area of your built up urban area was determined by the province back in 2006 with the first creation of the growth plan. And so if you think of North Dumfries, specifically the community area, it would have been the old village area, largely framed around Swan Street, Northumberland Street, and along the Swan Street, Stanley Street, Piper corridor as your axes. A designated greenfield area, or DUA, represents lands that are outside of the built-up area, but are within the settlement boundary, and they've been designated in the official plan for development. So most of our DUA area is along the southern tier of urban air, along the Swan Street, Brant Waterloo corridor. It's important we understand density because each area has different objectives or requirements. Within the built-up urban area, the growth plan 2020 requires that a minimum of 50% of future growth would be directed to built-up urban areas, which would mean that across the region, all new development, 50% would have to be located within those areas. The designated greenfield areas, the growth plan requires a minimum of 50 people and jobs per hectare within this area. There are three different growth options presented by the region through the draft land needs assessment for their community area. So remember, this is focusing on residential growth, institutional, commercial, retail. Community area number one, or option one, generally mirrors the minimum requirements of the growth plan. So if you can use the term, that's your starting point. The growth plan allows the densities that I just spoke of or the intensification levels. However, those should be considered your minimums. So as I mentioned a moment ago, 50% of the future growth was in the form of intensification and 50 people jobs per hectare within your greenfield developments. Staff, in reviewing option number one, have identified that obviously this would be your largest amount of land required for urban expansion, and across the region, it would require additional lands outside of the existing countryside line within the region. Option one, from a land use planning perspective, from a fiscal perspective, from a greenhouse gas emission, protection of agricultural lands, key natural heritage features, transit. This is not an attractive perspective. And in fact, it would represent a step backwards, both for the region of Waterloo, as well as the township of North Dumfries. The township over the last 5 years has experienced growth and development, both in forms of intensification as well as greenfield development that are substantially higher than what is currently modeled in option number one. This form of development, in the opinion of staff, would not achieve the overall objective of a 15-minute neighborhood where people could walk or cycle 4 seasons of the year to their schools, community parks, facilities, shopping, and where practical and possible, employment opportunities. This form of development would also reduce the overall mix of housing and housing affordability. Community option number 2 does represent a more compact form of development versus option 1. And it does provide for a broader spectrum of housing mix available to the marketplace. Option 2 would result in a smaller urban expansion area versus option 1. And across the region, all future growth could be accommodated within the existing countryside line. The most significant change is respect to direction of development to intensification and the overall density for future greenfield development. Where option 1 considered 50% intensification and density in greenfield sites at 50 jobs and persons per hectare, option 2 contemplates 60% of the future growth in the form of intensification, with, in the greenfield areas, 60 jobs and persons per hectare. The comments from staff with respect to option 2. Generally speaking, option 2 is more closely aligned with the built form that has emerged within urban air over the last 5 years. This density for the greenfield sites would be slightly higher than what North Dumfries has tracked. Generally speaking, over the last 5 years in our greenfield developments, we've been approximately 57 persons or jobs per hectare. However, to achieve the overall regional density mix of 60 persons and jobs per hectare, it actually means across the region, we would have to be closer to 63 persons per job or persons per hectare. Because not only are you looking forward to those future development of greenfield sites, but you have to account for the existing approvals and the gap that exists for those properties in the greenfield areas that either will have some form of status but not yet registered. So if you take a look at that, today we're about 57. Notionally, we would have to be closer to 63 persons and jobs per hectare. Community area option number 3 is the most compact urban form of each of the 3 growth models. To accommodate that future 300,000 plus persons that's forecast over the next 30 years, the region would not have to adjust any existing urban boundary to accommodate that future growth. So within the existing settlement boundaries, that future growth for the next 30 years could be accommodated. The designated greenfield areas, so those are existing designated but vacant greenfield areas, would be modeled at 66 persons and jobs per hectare, which means on an incremental basis, we'd be actually looking at closer to 73 persons and jobs per hectare. More of the dwelling units by proportion would be of higher density, which typically have a lower number of people per dwelling unit. Staff's comments related to option 3. That's a very dense greenfield development. And in the case of North Dumfries, I think would be difficult to achieve if I look at that 73 persons threshold. The missing middle, we often hear that term. It's another piece of planning jargon. But what the missing middle is trying to create a built form that can support a spectrum of housing styles and types that would support both seniors for independent living as an alternative to their traditional single detached dwelling, which they predominantly live in if you think of North Dumfries. But it also allows for the introduction of 4 to 6 story type buildings, whether it be rental or condominium, along with clustered housing. And that could be in the form of quad, 6, and 8-plex type units. So generally speaking, it would be a slightly lower built form versus the high rise, but overall you could achieve roughly the same density within your built up urban areas. And it would provide an alternative to living in a high rise. The next slide generally speaks to the overall land budget for each of the 3 growth models for the community land area, as per the draft from April 2022. So you can see across the top, we've identified each of the 3 options. And if you look at the very, very bottom, you look at the region-wide totals. So this would be the sum applicable to each of the 7 area municipalities. So to accommodate option 1, being the less dense, the region would actually have to create an additional 2,208 hectares of land for urban purposes. Option 2, they would need to reclassify 376 hectares. And in option 3, you recall that's within existing urban settlement boundaries, there would be the need to convert to 0 lands across the region.
So I'm looking at it before you go on. When you say the region total needs 376 or 2,208, what does that translate into individuals? Would you be able to figure that out?
Yes, it is in the regions tables. I don't have them as part of my presentation. But generally speaking, you're looking at a significant portion under option 1 of the future growth being accommodated in the expanded footprint of the urban areas.
But the province stated we need 306,000.
Sorry, we're talking 2 different things. So we have over 300,000 persons moving into the region. Okay. The region, based on the different density models, has said to accommodate that growth, they would need either 2,208 more hectares of land. So remember, 50% is intensification, 50% would be greenfield.
Yeah.
Under option 2, that's 60% intensification. Obviously, more people would be accommodated within the built urban area. And based on an increased density in the greenfield sites, they would only need 376 hectares of additional lands beyond what is already designated to meet the needs of that future 330,000 people.
Thank you.
So where you see a bracket around a number would be the deficit or additional lands required for each of the first 2 models measured in hectares for each of the 7 area municipalities. And that's based on the allocation of future growth to the area municipality, accounting for the intensification opportunities and the current vacant designated land inventory in each of the area municipalities. So in the case of North Dumfries, option 1, we would require the equivalent of 55 hectares of additional urban land outside of the current air urban service area. Under option 2, because it's a much more dense built form, we would require the equivalent of 29 hectares of additional land designated for urban purposes. And of course, option 3, which is applicable to all 7 area municipalities, no new lands would be required. Excuse me. Generally speaking, from options 1 through option 3, as it relates specifically to North Dumfries, we would be somewhere between 15 to 20% intensification of our future growth. Okay. Today, the township over the last 5 years has had about 17% of its growth accommodated through the form of intensification within our built-up urban area. Coming out of the 2015 regional exercise, the township was forecast by 2031 to accommodate the equivalent of 552 units within the built urban area. And as of February, we had either approved or had built the equivalent of 335 dwelling units within the built-up urban boundary. So the township is well on its way to achieving the intensification target as contemplated coming out of the current official plan to be achieved prior to 2031. The municipal comprehensive review and the land needs assessment and the update to the regional official plan, of course, because it looks at the big picture, it's the appropriate time to also go back and revisit historic approvals and to test earlier assumptions, modeling, and specifically properties that have been set aside for intended purpose. It is appropriate, in staff's opinion, to revisit the existing air urban area boundary as set out on our land use schedule in both the township's official plan and mirrored on in the regional official plan. There are 3 properties that staff identified in the report that are at the outer edges of urban air. They are difficult to accommodate either from an access perspective and or as it relates to servicing in an urban environment for municipal water and sewage services. So they do not recognize or represent logical or sequential development. They're not an efficient use of land, and they don't leverage things like committed infrastructure, road, active transportation, transit networks, parks, or facilities. Staff is recommending the council, as part of this exercise, we identify those 3 parcels as mapped shown on attachment 4 to the staff report. These 3 properties would total 10 hectares in area, and staff are recommending that those lands be taken out of the air urban service area and they be redistributed to the next logical area for urban development, which would be along Swan Street corridor in proximity to the Brant Waterloo Road. And that would then be part of your future growth. And as a net, there's 0 change in your overall land budget because lands are taken out of the settlement boundary and reallocated to a new or adjusted settlement boundary. Focusing now on employment, and remember, the region has approximately 177,000 new employment positions over the next 30-year time horizon. approximately 70,600 positions would be within the employment land area. Employment land area from a moment ago, when we were talking about terminology, is those areas where manufacturing, logistics, warehousing would be the dominant use. So think of an industrial park, business park setting. Almost 100,000, that future growth, would be distributed across your community urban areas, both in institutional settings, home-based businesses, telework opportunities, commercial and retail sectors, your downtowns and the like. So focusing on that approximate 70,600 target for employment-related uses, the region looked at two different scenarios. One, option one, identify a scenario where 15% of existing employment areas would be redeveloped through intensification and effectively, I'll call it more efficient use of those employment lands. So it might be an adaptive reuse or a conversion. By contrast, option two contemplates 25% of the existing employment areas across the region would be redeveloped and intensified to allow for a more efficient use of already identified employment areas. For both scenarios, options 1 and 2, the density would be equivalent to 35 jobs per hectare. And because of the difference in the intensification rates, obviously it shakes down to a higher amount of lands to be added for future employment. Option 1 will be 659 hectares across the region, and option 2 would be at 456 hectares across the region as an adjusted land budget for future employment purposes. So this table looks at option 1. Remembering this is the smaller amount allocated to intensification, and across the region would translate into the need for 659 additional hectares of land. You can see for each of the area municipalities, and I've highlighted North Dumfries, we are forecast to have an additional 2,700 persons between 2019 and 2051 to be directed to our employment areas. We would have a demand based on the intensification as well as overall yield of density per hectare. We would need 122 gross hectares of land to be accommodated to meet that threshold of 2,700 persons. We presently have 36 hectares of designated employment lands that are presently vacant. So when you subtract the 36 off the 122, which is our long-term requirements, we presently have a deficit of 86 hectares of land. So we would be required under this model to designate an additional 86 hectares of employment-related lands. By contrast, option 2, once again, the same number of employees, but there's a higher intensification rate across the region. So we still have the 2,700 positions if we're looking at North Dumfries. Our employment lands would be lowered in terms of what we would need to meet those future 2,700 persons. So now it's 114 hectares. We still have the same 36 hectares of land that are currently designated but vacant, and therefore a smaller land budget would be required to accommodate that forecast. And it would be in the form of 78 hectares of employment land that would be required to be designated within the boundaries of North Dumfries. So when I look at options 1 and 2, from an employment land perspective as presented by the region, the intensification within the context of North Dumfries would be difficult within the existing development areas. to achieve a redevelopment of 25% of the land area. And it's largely because of the nature of what our lands look like. They are significantly weighted to properties that have private well and septic systems, as well as the general nature of our land base is used for open storage and logistics related activities. So by their nature, they're large footprint type activities. Generally, option 1 would make more sense for the future employment related uses of North Dumfries in the absence of full urban services. The targeted properties would be along the Northumberland corridor between Greenfield and Highway 401 on either side. We already today have a mix and match of non-farm related employment uses along that corridor. And the land is very fractured by ownership, and the impact on farming has already been realized because of those historic planning decisions going back 20 plus years. The other would be along the 97-401 Business Park area, generally framing the Cedar Creek corridor. And this is where there's already been a significant investment in that corridor and the proximity to the 401 interchange as a spine. There has been correspondence received, and they were included in your circulated agenda. And then there was an addendum piece of correspondence received from MHBC this afternoon, which has also been circulated to council and posted on the website. As I mentioned, this exercise is region-led. The region is the party responsible for the land needs assessment and obviously the implications arising therefrom. However, it's important that council be aware that there are groups that have a different perspective on how the region should be forecasting both employment and residential growth going forward, and have critiqued and provided alternative models for the consideration of regional council as part of the ongoing public engagement phase that we're presently in. MHBC, on behalf of Hallman Construction Limited, and a proposed option 4, an alternative to a no community expansion based on an increased intensification target, have been prepared by professional personnel. And as I mentioned, have been circulated in your agenda so the council can see different perspectives and their implications arising therefrom. This correspondence has been provided for the purposes of information. Staff have not critiqued either of the 2 reports. So, Madam Mayor, that is a high level of key elements in staff's report that form part of the agenda, and I'm available at council's convenience to answer any questions.
Can you stop sharing, please? Thank you. Any questions, councillors? Any questions?
I do.
Do you have your raised hand? Councillor Austin?
Yeah, I'm trying to get on. You want to go to Councilor Roman first? So.
Councillor Roman, go ahead.
Madam Mayor, through you to CAO, I guess one of the areas I'm concerned about is the aggregate extraction, which is currently taking place in some of our industrial lands that are zoned for employment. So how is that reflected in this report? Is that part of the intensification you're talking about? Will those lands be excluded from our overall employment land totals, or are they slated for future intensification?
Madam Mayor, through to Councillor Roman. There are 2 employment parcels, both framing Cedar Creek Road. One is owned by Millgate Holdings, and it is opposite the 401 interchange. The other is Angbar Construction at the northwest corner of Dumfries Road and Cedar Creek. Both of those properties, coming out of the 2015 OMB approved regional official plan, were designated for industrial purposes. They both have existing licenses held by the Ministry of Natural Resources. But because the future position taken on those lands were for employment related purposes, they form part of our designated but vacant land inventory. So they've been accounted for, and they would be utilized as part of that modeling to accommodate the future 2,700 persons.
Councillor Rossman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to CEO McNeely. So with the residential targets for the town of Ayr, I guess you could say, the option number one is the largest expansion, yet it has the lesser amount of target density. So we're going to have the highest amount of single family homes and townhomes, et cetera, right? Option number two, by jamming more people in, we're going to have to put 4 and 6 level apartments and more townhomes up to get more people in a smaller area. When the region's looking at these options, how does the region expect all these people to get in and out of Ayr if we're not creating more ingress egress out of the town? We're just going to create more like traffic. It's going to be incredible if we don't have more access points in and out of the town. That's question number one. Sorry.
So, Madam Mayor, through to Councillor Oster. I think that's a fair comment about any of the growth models. Whatever scenario is ultimately adopted, then becomes incumbent upon government, township, region, then to ensure that the appropriate servicing strategy, transportation modes, community facilities, open space, etc., are available to respond to each of the different growth scenarios. So if I was to look at option 2 or option 3, there would be more reliance on active transportation, that 15-minute neighborhood that I spoke of a moment ago, where you try and provide services or programs within that 15-minute walk or cycling period from a point of destination being the residence, and or transit. Now, the region, as part of this exercise, has started to look at spines of future north, south, east, west corridors of transit, including the community of Ayr, connecting with other points of existing surface transit, whether it be the ION network or main east, west, north, south corridors within the cities. It would be imperative going forward to look at and embracing the introduction of transit into urban Ayr to allow for people to move through the region in an efficient manner to complement whatever we could achieve in that 15-minute neighborhood. Option 1 is not transit friendly in terms of promoting or offsetting the costs for the introduction of transit services.
Councillor Rossman, is that it?
Can I continue with my?
You said you had another question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So again, going back to option 1, it's less reliant on public transit, etc. However, it also reduces the amount of multi-level buildings, which create a lot of traffic density in one area, coming in and out of developments. So my concern is adopting something that from the region that puts a lot of people in one small area, a lot of cars to come in and out, creating more and more headaches and traffic jams. And the other quick question was, what power do we have as a township if we adopt any plan? When we adopt any plan, what power do we have as a township at any point, since we have to deal with the problems with traffics and traffic, etc.? What point do we have at any point can we declare a slowdown of development or a moratorium on development? Or can we say, not until we get more ingress, egress, access points in and out of here, can we develop any further? Do we decide that, or does the region just say, we don't care what, if you don't have enough roads, we want to grow, you need to grow, and we need to hit targets? I'm worried about hitting targets without the sense and sensibility of community, multiplexes, jamming people in one place, and then saying, okay, you guys deal with the traffic problem. We've seen that with some of the subdivisions that were developed. They were poorly planned, and we are the ones as township that have to sit back and deal with the fallout of decisions of other people, and I kind of feel helpless that we can't say, okay, we're putting the brakes on this, and until we figure out how we're going to get all these people in and out of here without them screaming through town and getting mad at each other and causing havoc and traffic jams. That's my concern.
So, Madam Mayor, through to Councillor Austin. So I'll give you the population budgets that are for each of the three growth scenarios, just so you can get an idea of order of magnitude. So for option one, the population by 2051 would be approximately 18,800. Remembering today, we've got a population of about 11,300. For option two, is actually a higher population, 19,600 persons. And option three forecasts future population of 17,200. Under the current official plan that was approved by the OMB in June of 2015, we were already modeled to grow by 2031 to a population of 16,000 persons. Okay. So if you take a look at each of those three models, you're looking at the incremental adjustment above 16,000. So specific to Councillor Oster's concern about who's in control in the present period through the land needs assessment and the update to the regional official plan coming through this exercise, it is regional council. They've been empowered, as have all upper tiers across Ontario, to undertake this methodology and to use the provincial forecast and to assign land budgets. Once the official plan is created at the regional level, we're obligated under the Planning Act to create an official plan that conforms to not only provincial policies and plans, but also has to conform with the regional official plan. We cannot work at cross purposes. So if we were looking at a new greenfield area, let's just use as an example the southwest quadrant of Ayr, and we had all of those lands between Swan Street over to Nith Road and north of the Brant Waterloo Road as a potential growth area. It would be my recommendation to Township Council that you would not look at that in an isolation basis. That was the mistake of the township prior to 2015. Looked at individual parcels in isolation, and the opportunity for connectivity and the macro picture of how things were to be integrated was lost. Similar to what we just gone through in the Cambridge West development, that was the subject of a public meeting a few weeks ago, we'd be promoting the premise of a secondary plan, which looks at the larger parcel, the hierarchy of land uses, the integration of both road networks by hierarchy, as well as active transportation, transit opportunities. And so then you come up with a phasing scheme or strategy, and by policy, you can create checks and balances to ensure that certain aspects of community building, complete neighborhoods are in place or have been approved to be moved forward to facilitate the next round of growth. But it's done in a logical and sequential manner, understanding the big picture of where you want to be, and then incrementally how you would achieve that on a parcel by parcel basis so that it fits into that larger puzzle.
Councilor McCreary.
Question for CAO, can you leave?
No action. Leave from here. There you go.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
I have a question about option 3. Staff are not recommending option 3. However, I would note that with option 3, we don't have to lose any agricultural land at all. Option 3, there's 0 additional land needed. However, with option 2, 29 hectares are needed. So option 3 was described as being too difficult to achieve and it's not being desirable. I wonder if you can elaborate on why we cannot consider option 3 or it's not feasible.
Option 3, if it was to be implemented by the region, would actually have a lower population threshold than what the community has already been approved coming out of the 2015 OMB official plan. Please remember that 1,400 persons have been identified to be in the Cambridge Westland. That was not part of the original 16,000 persons that were identified for the community. They were layered on coming out of the OMB decision and placed above the 16,000 persons. They are included in the regional forecast of 17,200 persons. So if you subtract the 1,400 persons assigned to Cambridge West out of the 2051 population, you would actually have a population smaller than what you already have rights to, that you've already designated lands for, and you've already approved development applications. So you would actually have to go back and repeal certain decisions and face, unfortunately, an OMB challenge or an Ontario Land Tribunal challenge because you're taking away something that has already gone through a planning process for approvals. It would mean 0 intensification under the region's model, as well as curbing approvals that have already been conferred based on an approved official plan.
I'm not sure I understand that. I think option 3 says that there be 5,900 additional people. But you're saying that the land that's here already has already been taken up by developers so that we couldn't achieve the targets that option 3 is requiring?
So what I indicated, option 3 would contemplate an overall population in 2051 of 17,200 persons. Today, the 2015 OMB approved official plan contemplates a population of 16,000 persons by 2031. Coming out of the June 2015 official plan approval by the board, 1,400 persons were added on top of the 16,000 persons to account for the Cambridge West development. So if you were to subtract the 1,400 persons off of the 2051 model of 17,200 persons, you would be under 16,000 persons by 2051. You would have a decrease in the overall population from what already exists based on the approved official plan, both in terms of lands designated in the urban area of Ayr, as well as you have almost significantly approved all of those lands for development consistent with approved official plan policies. That means under the region's model, you would have a negative growth, you would have no intensification, and you would have a problem as it relates to historic approvals or development based on an approved official plan. I have flagged this to the region as a problem in their model. They have not come back with a solution as to how their model would be recalibrated. So based on what we have, I'm saying it is not an attractive model because it is regressive in its nature.
Anything else, Councilor McCreary?
I'll give that some thought. Thanks.
Maybe if you get some time with CEO McNeely, he can explain it better. Councilor Roman?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to the CAO. Just trying to wrap my head around the difference between option 1 and option 2. With option 1 in the past, that provides us with the DCs that allow us to create these bypass roads that Councilor Ross was talking about, different ways of getting in and out of the Village of Ayr. With option 2, increased density, would that also allow us to leverage those DCs to build new roads if the population, as you say, in option 2 would be 19,600 as opposed to option 1 with 18,800? There's a lot more stress on our infrastructure. So I'm just curious how that works. If we go with higher densities, does it allow us to leverage any sort of additional money to build those needed extra roads? And also, as you mentioned with option 2, a lot of it is sort of hinging on having transit. Is transit really something that's going to be in the future of Fort Dumfries, or are we going to be in a situation where we have a lot of 6-story buildings, the missing middle, but no way for people to access those buildings? I'm concerned that we've been set up in the past to be an option 1 sort of community, and now we're going to try to transition to be an option 2 community. We don't have the infrastructure for the roads, we don't have the infrastructure for transit. So where does that leave us as a township?
So, Madam Mayor, through to Councilor Councilor Rowland, apologize. In any of the growth scenarios, we would have to go back and revisit our current development charges bylaw. Our current development charges bylaw, which went into effect in 2020, was based on a certain amount of growth spread across the township, principally within urban Ayr, and based on when that growth was occurring, the nature of that growth, and where that growth was assigned, had different implications as it related to our road network, fleet, recreational facilities, parks, and the like. And from that, we were able to look at unit mix, and there was a scalable form of a development charge based on unit type. When a new model is ultimately adopted by the region, and depending upon where that model is and where that growth would be allocated in terms of parcels, then we would update the development charges bylaw to look at the implications of growth based on that scenario and what the implications would be on things like our park system facilities, fleet, and infrastructure such as our road network. And we would then, through that analysis, make recommendations to adjust any adjustments necessary to our development charges to fund those long-term capital items that are attributed to growth.
Councilors, any other questions or comments? Seeing none, next, do the motion next, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we have 2 delegates.
So next we have a presentation from Kevin Thomason. You have 5 minutes, Kevin. Is he on yet, Cynthia? Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me there okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, just give me a second here. I'm going to share my screen and my presentation. Hopefully it will come up okay. All right, are you able to see my screen here? A title slide saying Regional Official Plan Proposed Option Number 4. Excellent. Okay, great.
Yes,
My name is Kevin Thomason, and I am with Smart Growth Waterloo Region, and I'm here tonight to talk about the Waterloo Regional Official Plan update that's currently underway to determine our vision, priorities, and the form of our community for the next 30 years. Our last ROP created the countryside line concept, the protected countryside, light rail transit, core renewal, and so many other bold, innovative concepts that we now take for granted we can't even imagine our community without them. This ROP update needs to be just as bold and visionary if Waterloo Region is to compete globally in the years ahead. However, planning for the future in a rapidly changing world is not easy. Climate change is the most significant threat facing our community today, with every decision carrying an important message and having a potential impact. There has been a fraction of the public engagement, public consultation, and media coverage on this ROP update compared to previous official plans, and we need far more public input and time to understand the implications of the feedback and ideas being proposed. Regional staff are proposing 3 growth options: However, all may be overly complicated and insufficient to meet future needs, particularly in light of the climate change commitments to reduce our greenhouse gases by 80% within the timeframe of this official plan. Option 1 has massive amounts of urban sprawl, huge farmland loss, and breaches the countryside line in numerous places, abandoning the goals of regional sustainability and leadership. Option number 2 still destroys over almost 1,000 acres of local farmland and creates complex inequity issues between area municipalities. Option number 3 is overly complex, difficult to achieve, and places too much density at the periphery rather than the core of our communities. Citizens and community groups concerned about the 3 proposed options are suggesting a simpler, more congruent 4th option based on current trends and rates of intensification, with no boundary expansion and no farmland loss. It buys time to see how the post-pandemic world unfolds without locking us into sprawl that may not be needed or wanted, and it treats all area municipalities equally. You'll see on the right here, the option number 4 compared to option 1, 2, and 3 that you just heard Mr. McNeely describe so excellently. And you'll see our new proposed growth option number 4 has a slightly higher intensification rate of 65%, which is actually very congruent with regional averages of 64 to 70% currently. And we've got a lower 60 people and jobs per hectare density than option number 3, which is far more achievable. And best of all, no acres of farmland or green space lost to urban sprawl. So what is North Dumfries doing to meet its climate crisis goals? There's, as I mentioned, already a 50% commitment by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2050. So proposing more low density, single detached urban sprawl is not likely to go over well with the public, knowing that we have to change from what created this global climate crisis. North Dumfries should be leading the protection of farmland, not promoting the development of it, particularly given the amount of farmland lost in the township already due to aggregates. Creating car-dependent, low-density urban sprawl subdivisions and bedroom communities isn't sustainable in a climate crisis. There is a tremendous need and opportunity to create sustainable, complete, walkable, 15-minute communities with a wide variety of services and housing choice. North Dumfries can lead by example by not targeting farmland for destruction and perhaps repurposing exhausted aggregate pits instead for industrial development or employment plans. Undertake a study of intensification and sustainable growth opportunities on existing lands and within existing communities. And upholding the countryside line and ensuring that remaining lands last for generations to ensure future housing choice. There's a need to aim for intensification and opportunities to create more complete communities with housing options and services for existing residents, in particular, seniors who don't want to leave rural communities. And we can't underestimate the size of this wave of seniors coming in the future. And we need to learn from what's already sought after, as we see, for example, some apartment buildings in the towns of St. Jacobs and St. Clements that are highly desired by residents in that area. We need to balance the number of new homes being created with the number of new employment opportunities being created so that you don't become a commuter community that vacates every day. Proposed option number 4 has many advantages. It's not perfect. However, it is the simplest, most consistent, and most easily achievable. It best continues Waterloo Region's innovation and planning leadership on the current trajectory, and it demonstrates climate leadership and that we're serious about achievable solutions to meet our Paris Accord commitments. It best supports ION LRT and public transit, as well as other sustainable initiatives. And it buys time on future boundary expansions until we see how the post-pandemic world, the missing middle, soft intensification, accessory units, age and neighborhood initiatives, and climate change unfolds in the coming years. It also avoids the myriad of issues with option number 2, allocating greenfield expansions to only some area municipalities, and all of the efforts required now to mitigate battles over land that won't even be needed for many years. In conclusion, we urge you to recommend and support the community proposed growth option number 4. While it's not perfect, it's the simplest, most achievable, and most congruent option that best prepares everyone for a rapidly changing future while protecting our thriving countryside and creating more dynamic, complete, sustainable, and affordable communities. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing there for a second and you can see me a little more clearly. Any questions on anything I've presented there?
Just give me a minute here.
Sorry, Mayor
Yeah.
Fox still joining.
My turn now. Councilors, do I have any questions?
Councilor McCreary.
Councilor McCreary?
Wouldn't option 4 have the same problems associated with it as option 3, which CEO McNeely has said is not workable for North Dumfries?
The question, really good question. And I think the challenge we face as a community was option number 3 was by far the most appealing, simply because there's no farmland loss. And if we look, we've seen other municipalities such as Hamilton has decided to stay within their existing boundaries with no expansion on farmland. We've seen the region of Halton also as well decide no permanent urban boundary expansion and to stay within the existing lands and lands that are already designated. And I think people realize we're in a climate crisis, we're in a climate emergency, and it's just not sustainable to lose any more farmland, particularly now when you look at what's happening with the Ukraine and potentially the food crisis that the United Nations and everyone is predicting for this coming winter. So I think within the public, there was a lot of dismay when the region came out with option number 3 based on density. And the problem with density, as Mr. McNeely explained, is there's a lot of challenges trying to project and calculate on density because density is based over time. And we've only been averaging about 54 people and jobs per hectare in the region the last few years, which is good. That's up from 42 people and jobs per hectare a decade earlier ago. So it's moving in the right direction. But under option number 3 with density, to suddenly leap all the way up to 66 people and jobs per hectare, which in reality really requires us to be at 73 or 74 people and jobs per hectare because of the way it averages out over time to get to 66, density becomes a really awkward and really challenging measure. So we as a community were really disappointed. Option number 3, the one with no farmland loss that the public was really counting on to give us the sustainable future we needed, was suddenly using metrics and densities that just don't make sense in our region. And that's why we decided to come up with option number 4, focused on intensification. Intensification is what we're doing already. It's looking at how do we spread those people throughout the entire community. And if you look at the incredible core renewal we've been seeing in Waterloo and Kitchener, those are classic textbook cases of intensification being done really well along nodes and corridors, arterial roads, transit supported areas and such. And the interesting thing was when we started to crunch the numbers for our option number 4, the intensification rates that we would have to hit in order to fit those people that the province is allocating actually was only 65 to 66%, which is very close to the 64% we've been averaging the last 5 years. And in fact, last year we were well over 70%. So it's very congruent with the numbers we're already achieving. It's what people are already seeing and are expecting as they look around our region and seeing growth. And that's one of the things that makes our option number 4 so appealing, is it continues growth in a congruent, consistent manner to what we're seeing already. And it also, by not designating any farmland now, allows us to buy time into the future. And the nice thing with these MCRs or these official plans is, as Mr. McNeely said, they have to be reviewed every 10 years and every 5 years. So we will have lots of chances down the road to see if the post-pandemic world, well, we can't even predict how many people are coming to the office tomorrow. How are we going to need how are we going to know how much office space we need in 10 years? The advantage of not designating the lands now, but simply working on intensification, the missing middle, the accessory units, and all these things that inclusionary zoning, all these things we want to work on anyways, we also already have large amounts of land banked already. Let's live off that for a little while, see how all these things work out. And if in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years, it turns out that we're short of lands, we can always bring them in at that point. But if we bring them in now, irrevocably, thinking that we may need them in 2047 or whatever point in the future, that might not be very wise, because if we turn out we don't need them, as Mr. McNeely says, we get into an excess lands capacity situation, and trying to undesignate lands or deal with excess lands is not a pretty situation and not anything we want to get into. So the idea of option number 4 being a placeholder that allows us to continue on our current trajectory while buying some time to see how the future unfolds, I think is very appealing and a real strong point of it.
Councillor Osner and then Councillor Roman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My comments are more comments than questions. When I look at these numbers and that, I see what the region is talking about, and you're talking about cities, you're talking about larger growth areas, you're comparing to Hamilton, you're comparing to Halton, you're comparing that. People come out to North Dumfries because they don't want to be in Hamilton, they don't want to be in Toronto, they don't want to be in Halton, they don't want to be in Kitchener, they don't want to be in Waterloo. They want to have some room to breathe. Now, the region's bringing the templates of the cities into us and slightly modifying them and asking us to adopt something that puts 60 people per hectare, and then saying, well, you know, the whole carrot out of this is no more farmland loss, but we're going to review it every 5-10 years or whatever. And then if that changes, which it will, then you're gonna start instituting, or not you personally, sorry, the region's gonna start instituting we need to grow. We need to now move into the farmlands. And now we have upped it to 60 people per square hectare. And so now you're bringing the intensification out into the farmland because we have to grow, because we need to grow, because there's no more land. We need to move out. You can only bust at the seams for so long, and then you need to grow out. So my concern with this whole thing for North Dumfries in particular is people don't come out here to live in Toronto or Kitchener or Waterloo. They come out here to have a little bit of space, to have what they perceive and believe is a better quality of life than growing up in the city. And now the city's chasing them down and saying, you can run, but you can't hide. I'm not so sure I'm crazy about most of these issues. I certainly don't want to lose farmland, but I think we're going to lose it anyway at one point or another. I'm more concerned with doing responsible growth that does not pack as many people as you can into a square hectare, because that's when people start arguing, fighting, bickering. We've seen it up in our subdivisions where our intensification at this point right now, there's too many people stuck together. When you get that many people stuck together, some people just don't like each other, and they don't come out here to be face to face with their neighbors when they stand out in the back and somebody's right in your face. People want their space. That's why they come out here. So that's my comment. It's not really a question. It doesn't require defending. It's just my concerns about the reason why people come out to the country versus your city numbers.
Thank you, Councillor.
No, and if I can comment on our experiences at Wellesley Township last week, as well as Wilmot Township last week. And in fact, I'm actually due up to speak in Woolwich in just a few minutes. But Mark Reeser, who is your next delegation, who is, I believe, there with you this evening, will talk about, and you even saw the slide in my presentation about ensuring we're meeting the needs of our existing residents. And one of the things that we talked about in Wellesley Township last week was the fact that when you look at the numbers from Statistics Canada, right now 59% of the residents in their township have only 1 or 2 occupants in those houses. And in fact, by 2051, at the end of this official plan period, Wellesley Township will have over 3,000 of their residents that are over 70 or 80 years of age. And Wellesley was very pleased because in their planning, in their staff report, they had made a recommendation to build 100 units of higher density housing. And this was different than the single greenfield detached homes that was everything they've ever built in the past. This was going to be some apartments or townhouses or some sort of semis or something like that. But when we pointed out that their progressive plan was building 100 units, but by 2051, they would have 3,000 residents of their township, or well over a third of their population in the 70 to 80 age range, and that most of those people are already living in houses that only have 1 or 2 people in them, that if you look at with only 100 units coming and 3,000 people needing them, now admittedly, some of those people are going to die before hitting 80 or whatever, but they're going to be about 2,900 units short here potentially, or even if you divide it in half and assume they live in pairs, 1,500 units short. And the last thing you want to be doing is driving thousands of people, of your residents, out of your community because you have no suitable housing for them and their existing house they're in right now has just gotten too big. So I think one of the things we really need to be looking at is we look to the future is where are demographics going? Well, what are the needs going to be for our current residents? Building a whole bunch of single family detached greenfield homes might be great for a whole bunch of Mississauga commuters, but they're not going to do a whole lot for our existing residents and seniors who are looking for housing choice or different options, be it more affordable options or just more easier to manage options. So I think that's going to be one of the things that we really need to look at. And in fact, in Wellesley, it caused their their council to vote unanimously against recommendation for option number 2, and to say, look, we clearly need a better plan coming up for our future of our community, because our community needs will be changing, and how do we best meet that? And so I would agree. This comes back to some of the points in my presentation too. We don't have all the information we need on this. This is very rushed. We need more engagement. We need more consultation. We need more time, even as a community, to wrap our minds around this. And it's almost absurd. The region is expecting that you as a council tonight will be able to make a decision in just one evening on this, when it's the next 30 years of the township's future that's being irrevocably set forward here.
Thank you, Councillor Roman.
Madam Mayor, my question through to Kevin, I guess, basically is, I find it disingenuous to say that we'll be saving farmland when you look at any of the options, option 1, 2, 3, or 4, all of them require more construction, whether it be high-rise apartment buildings or whether it be single-family homes, and all that concrete is coming out of North Dumfries Township. So the regional Waterloo can sit around and say, we're going to preserve farmland in Woolwich and Wellesley and Wilmot, but North Dumfries Township is going to be an open strip mine. And all that concrete is going to go to all this new intensification and development. So for this council to sit here and say that we are going to sacrifice our town and our citizens by having higher density, and the payoff for us is going to be that we're going to have all of our gravel taken out to build Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge. It's a pretty hard sell for this council to endorse option 4, when really there's no plan whatsoever to help mitigate the amount of gravel pit operations taking place in North Dumfries Township.
Yeah.
And if I may add on to that, you have to consider that North Dumfries Township, if you take a map of North Dumfries, over 70% of the land mass is aggregate, and that's all of the farmland.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was sent a horrific map today showing all the areas designated, whether other applications or active pit permits in North Dumfries Township. And it's horrific. Most of the map is yellow. And I must admit, aggregates is a tremendously challenging situation for everyone, but in particular for North Dumfries. And about the only way I can answer is option number 4 is the option that uses the least concrete, because with the focus on intensification, it's trying to put the most number of people within the existing cities where we already have infrastructure such as sidewalks and sewers and streets and such already in place. I know it's not a lot, but it's a small consolation of it's the better of the options from that perspective.
I see no other comments. Thank you, Kevin. And next.
Thank you very much.
Mark, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for your patience. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Reeser. I farm in Wilmot Township here in UD. I am presently, I'm present here today in my capacity as Vice President of Waterloo Federation of Agriculture. Incidentally, I'm also Vice President of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, representing about 38,000 farmers. So I'm here today to kind of speak in a high-level way about what's going on here in the Waterloo region. And I'd like to bring an agriculture and perhaps a rural perspective to the discussion, and about the options for our scenario, and to also encourage you, both elected and staff, to continue to plan well, protect what is good, and set an example for the rest of Ontario. And I say all this in the context of knowing, Mayor, that this place is underlain with aggregate, and you have been dealt a horrible hand by the province. It's unfortunate and it's wrong. And by the way, you have the full support of the Federation and in terms of your fight to do what is right. So I just say that as a background.
Thank you.
So we live in a special place here in Waterloo. I would say it's arguably the most innovative, dynamic, prosperous urban municipality in Ontario, if not all of Canada. And that's really something special. At the same time, surrounding this urban footprint is one of the most fertile, productive, and prosperous agricultural communities in all of Ontario. It's been identified in the last census as having the second highest income per acre and the second highest income per farm of any county in the province. And it would be number one if you didn't take into account the greenhouse operations of Chatham County. And that's something special. This is an agricultural powerhouse here in Ontario. So a culture of good planning, countryside lines, protected countryside designation, environmentally sensitive landscapes, a commitment to public transportation, an innovative official plan, and densities that surpass provincial targets all contribute to our success. Our planning regime and culture is responsible for our unique position as a leader in Ontario, and our municipal comprehensive review with our land needs assessment and resulting official plan must again be a template for good planning, farmland protection, and prosperity in municipalities across the province. And I tell you, in my dealings with people across Canada, when I say I'm from Waterloo, they know what I'm talking about. And of course, they identify the high-tech sector, but they also identify good planning. And believe it or not, they also identify the Waterloo Region Water Quality Program, which is unique in North America. And that's us. That's us doing things differently than everybody else. So in the 4 years since the last census, the loss of farmland in Ontario has risen from 175 acres per day to more than 319 acres per day, or 116,000 acres annually. We just tend to think of ourselves, but really need to look at the whole province. That's quite simply not sustainable. We talk a lot about sustainability. That is not sustainable. And if society is increasingly reliant on photosynthesis, that's what farmers do. Take the sunshine, soil, and water and make stuff. For both food and for energy. The preservation of agricultural land and soil health is essential. So we've got a long history of visionary planning here at Waterloo. And I've used this example before, and I'm sure you've heard it before, Mayor, but I'm going to use it again because I think it's instructive. If the cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge had the same urban densities as pick an American city, Atlanta, Dallas, Orlando, our urban footprint here in Waterloo would encompass all of North Dumfries Township, all of Wilmot, all of Wellesley, all of Woolwich, and 2 additional townships. There would be no farmland left in Waterloo Region, so we in fact have done a good job of planning in the past. But I would suggest we need to do better. Please don't be seduced, intimidated, or coerced by those who say we have no choice but to sprawl. Because we do have a choice. There is always a choice, and we need to choose wisely. There is no rush to reach a decision because there is no deadline that can't be extended. Let's slow down this process. Let's think things through, consider other options such as option 4, and consult further with the public as to what they want Waterloo Region and North Dumfries Township to look like in the future. We are essentially at a crossroads or a fork in the road. Do we backtrack and give in to those who think that the answer to housing needs is more sprawl? Or do we continue our visionary planning process that protects rural lands for agriculture, local food, groundwater recharge, habitat for biodiversity, a process that respects people's different housing needs, promotes livable, complete communities, ensures affordability, and is truly sustainable in the long term? Philosophically, we farmers are selling a vision that protects farmland and the landscape. That's everything that's out there, not in the city. Addresses the need to provide housing for all, including aging baby boomers like myself and my fellow farmer here, Jeff. I'm the official baby. Perhaps some of you too. Reflects the implications of our changing climate and provides a practical, attainable, flexible, and affordable alternative to the status quo. This vision could be the basis for a new and improved regional growth management strategy, and we should do that. Accept the vision, and you arrive at a goal net zero for bigger residential urban footprint. Only growth option 4 has potential to fulfill that vision required to guide us responsibly and sustainably in the future. It's based on several very simple principles. An intensification rate of about 68%. In 2021, we did 72. So we're already doing it. It's actually status quo. A density of about 60 people and jobs per hectare, less than 2 and 3. No loss of farmland, and total conformity to the province's formula for LNAs. Total conformity. So please give this option some consideration and join us in advancing a vision. And I'd like to say in conclusion, and I mean this genuinely, and I'll say this from my members and farmers in general, thank you all for what you do. I know that councillors don't get a whole lot of thanks. So whether I or we agree with you or not, you're elected. And thank you for running and thank you for winning. It's a tough job and I'm glad you're doing it. So applause from Jeff.
And staff.
And staff, absolutely. So be courageous in what you do and be courageous as you make tough and difficult decisions, because that's left up to you. Be bold, be visionary, and don't be afraid to be different. Don't be afraid to innovate, and don't be afraid to scream like hell when the province does stupid things like say your entire township has to be ripped up for aggregate, because that's wrong. And never stop speaking forcefully and eloquently to those with resources and those in power. And finally, remember there is only one landscape, only one. And that people, the natural environment, and agriculture all have to share. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilor McCreary?
Yes, I have a question about the rehabilitation of gravel pits. And I'd like to have your opinion on that. When a license is now issued.
I'm sorry, is that appropriate for me to do?
Of course, you can ask you. You can always say, sorry, it's not your expertise.
No, I'd be glad to answer.
Well, when a license is issued, there's a site plan, and that always includes rehabilitation, where the land is supposed to be put back to agricultural use. And I would like to call on your expertise to let us know, is that actually possible to put the land back to agricultural use? And some of the companies actually claim that the land will even be better after they're done with it. So I'm wondering what you think about the rehabilitation of gravel pits.
It's probably too much to ask and for me to answer in a short.
If I may, I sit on Tatnall with you, Margaret, and as you know, most of those layers on Tatnall are farmers, and they say that it does not ever go back to decent farmland, ever. The quality, because they strip out all the good soil and they sell it off, and they bring in not so good soil. Good, is that diplomatic enough, CO McNeely? Yes, not so good soil.
You're right. First of all, I would say rehabilitation question mark, quotation marks. It took 10,000 years since the last glacier to make that soil, and the underlying soils, it's very difficult and close to, I'll say close to impossible to replicate that with a bulldozer and, you know, smoothing it out and adding some little tiny bit of topsoil on top. It's really tough. Can it be done? I'm not going to say it can't, but I'm going to say it hardly ever happens. And you know why? Because it's expensive. It's a tough job to do. How do you take a hole in the ground and turn it into a field? And I think that the legislation should say that if you are going to get a license, you have to rehabilitate that pit back to its original productive capacity. So if it formerly produced 200 bushels of corn per acre, you are obligated to rehabilitate that land until it can produce that again. Currently, that doesn't occur. Currently, hardly any pits are rehabilitated. They're just left forever in a deplorable state and nothing ever happens. It's a shame and it's wrong. And we know why it happens. Because the province is the biggest purchaser of gravel in the province. And they have no reason to increase the cost. And it really should, I have to say, it should cost more because rehabilitation is expensive. I'm sorry, I could go on.
No, and so could we, Mark, so we'll let that in there. Thank you very much, Councillor. I see no other questions. CEO McNeely, can we discuss your motion for a moment? I've heard Kevin and Mike both talk about, we're being pushed, I think we're being pushed really hard to make a decision and move forward. And they've talked about delay, and we should, until we get this right. You and I are both, neither one of us are like the lands needs studies that they've done. There's pieces missing, and now there's more reports coming because they found out they didn't do them. Would it be appropriate to say that, yes, we support your recommendation, but we want a deferral until it is more appropriate and we get a complete answer? We have to do this right. If we're going to take into 2051, I will shut up, Suzanne. If we're going to take into 2051, then we have to do it right now.
So, Madam Mayor, the past government, of course, we just had an election on June 2nd. Okay? So the process to date has been under the past government. They actually required upper tiers to submit their municipal comprehensive reviews and land needs assessments to the government by July 1st. Waterloo region is already behind that timetable. Some upper tiers have already submitted their information. Hamilton's a prime example. The region continues on their path of public engagement, and that's just to occur through to mid-July, which is about 6 weeks from now, at which time they hope to hold a statutory public meeting as required under the Planning Act. Under their current timetable, they're also proposing that in August to hold a regional council meeting to have a decision on the land needs assessment, the update to the regional official plan, and to submit all of that documentation to the province for approval. So there is a time frame. It is the one that was charted by the past provincial government. Obviously, no one today knows whether the current government will change those parameters, but that's what we're working within. I'm concerned that if we as a township don't signal the matters of concern, opportunities to the region, we may then lose out in the bigger picture because they are marching along to make certain decisions. And right now there's no comment formally from the township. Staff in a series of meetings with regional officials have raised certain concerns about methodology, the implications, and the like, but those aren't from township council. And I think it's important that township council provide a touch point. The next regional meeting to deal with the land needs assessment, I believe, is a week from Wednesday. And the intent was documentation coming out of today would be considered by a regional committee approximately 10 days from now. It does not mean that your process for inputting doesn't stop. As other information becomes available, it would be the intent that staff would come back with future reports. The option 4 paper unto itself, I think there are elements that do make some sense. My concern is it doesn't break it down to an area municipality basis. So I have no understanding of what the population modeling would be based on those models. I have no idea of what that would look like. So while I can, in my mind, think about secondary suites, which council has embraced, going back to 2018. I look at the empty nesters and how to better utilize that inventory. Those are all good practices. I don't know what the implications are because it hasn't been broken out in terms of what does it mean in terms of future dwelling units, population assignment, uptake within the respective municipalities, and then critique it like we have the regional models.
And Kevin spoke about we can always readdress it in 5 or 10 years. But as Councillor Osner says, the damage is already done. Or the intensification and that potentially could not work or may not work is already done. How do you detensify? So again, I don't see that as a viable option. Councillor McCreary, you had your hand up. Did you take it down?
I'll ask the question. A question for CEO Neely, the mayor. I'm going back to my question about option 3 and why you feel we can't do it. With the population projection of 5,900 people, you're saying that we would end up with too many people? Like it would be over the projection? I thought that the report said that if the projections of population were guidelines, and that in your development, if you actually went over the projected population, there's no consequences to that. It's just guidelines. So I don't understand why, if we took option 3, that would mean we'd have to go back to the developers and tell them they couldn't build what they want to build because we would end up with too many people.
So Madam Mayor, through to Councillor McCreary, it's a combination of factors. So the target population is just that, it's a target. Okay, so think of it as an envelope. It's how you achieve that targeted population. So it's how much of that future population is accommodated within the built urban boundary. Typically, those have lower persons per unit per dwelling, just given the nature of the housing that occurs in that form of development. But the other is the overall density, okay, of units or persons per hectare, okay? And as I mentioned, the population modeling for option 3 under the regional model is 66 persons per hectare for jobs and persons. But when you actually have to look to the future and then go backwards, because of those current vacant and designated sites, it's equivalent to 73 persons per job and per hectare. And I'm saying that is a very dense form versus what you've had in the past, okay? My last comment was, of that 5,900 future persons, you'd be subtracting 1,400 off because they were actually layered on top of the 16,000 persons that were already in the approved township official plan through the OMB. Okay, so under the region's model for option 3, not including the Cambridge Westlands, you'd be looking at 5,800 new persons. Okay, so you'd be below the 16,000 population you already have, based on the densities and the intensification split.
Councillor Roman.
Madam Mayor, I guess my question is through you to the CAO. When we look at all the options, 1 through 4, it seems that 1 is basic continuation of what we've done in the past, years ago, sort of unbridled growth. Whereas 3 and 4 are basically zero growth or, maybe less growth or constrained growth. So obviously option 2 is the one that's being positioned to be the best choice because it gives us some growth, doesn't take up a lot of farmland, although recognizing that farmland will be destroyed by gravel pits. But I'm just curious, I know Councillor Osmer and I share the same concern. What will the Village of Ayr look like in 10 years under option 2? How many mid-rise, how many high-rise, how many people living in a higher dense situation are we going to have? And are we going to lose that sense of what Ayr has been in the past? What would Ayr, I guess, in some ways, we're looking backwards at what Ayr used to be. We're concerned about the future of air. We love air the way it is. So I know it's hard to ask, but what's a snapshot of air in, say, 15 years?
So if some variation of option 2 occurred, generally speaking, your greenfield development would be representative of the subdivisions that you have approved over the last 5-year period. In each of those subdivisions, you have purposely incorporated the 15-minute principle. You have put in walkway and off-road paths for connectivity to key destinations. You have protected woodlots and sensitive areas, and where appropriate, you've actually incorporated them into the urban fabric through view corridors and the like, but they've been protected. You have centralized community facilities so that people have the ability to walk or cycle.
Mark, you can go.
I apologize, sorry. I have to apologize. Thank you.
And you have had introduced a variety of housing styles. Where your intensification has occurred has largely been on the higher order roads, like Swan Street and Northumberland Street. So you've purposely not done it within your established neighborhoods. You've allowed some severance activity, but you haven't directed your intensification units there. You've gone to functionally obsolete properties, like the old Schneider meat plant, and or strategically around the edges of the downtown or on your main street, your key north-south roads. But I would suggest to you, that's where your future intensification or the majority of your future intensification would occur. It would be at your edges of your downtown, principally on the Northumberland, Swan, Stanley corridor. You're putting people within a 15-minute walk of your downtown, which will support retail and commercial opportunities because the downtown becomes part of their neighborhood. It does mean we as a township have to be more cognizant of that active transportation opportunity and make sure that we're building the infrastructure to support walking and cycling. It also means we may actually start approaching the critical mass where we could support a transit system to provide connection then to the adjacent cities for higher order commercial retail opportunities, higher order entertainment, or work related connectivity. So you need a certain amount of people to support that type of surface transit system. You don't have it today. You are improving it, and each of the subdivisions that we're designing, we lay out a road system and potential transit stops so that if it emerges, that those opportunities can be leveraged. But your higher form of development, the Northumberland, Stanley, Swan corridor, forms a logical north-south axis for that transit-related development for those longer distance trips that go beyond that 15-minute principle. Sorry, Madam Mayor, I just want to say, and you won't be witnessing, the 30 and 40 story. I mean, you're generally going to be in that 4 to 6 story development on those higher order roads, intermixed with clustered townhouses, stacked townhouses, quads, 6-plex, 4-plex. But it would be along those spine corridors, largely protecting the character of your established neighborhoods, and then your greenfield would be generally representative of the mix of housing you have. The other advantage of opening up a portion of land in that south west quadrant is now you can put a mixed-use development. It's identified in the staff report. So now you can look at having a commercial retail neighborhood development with 2nd story or 3rd story apartment units, broadening the range of housing, but more importantly, you're providing programs and services through the private sector to support that 15-minute walk neighborhood. And it complements your downtown, and it complements what's already available generally in the Northumberland Greenfield area. So now that once again reinforces that 15-minute neighborhood principle.
Councilor Rowland.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So just as a follow-up then, we look at recent developments along Northumberland Street, the one that the corner of Greenfield Road and Northumberland, for example, the townhouse development that's going on right now, and compare that to, say, the 170 Northumberland, where you have the 3 apartment buildings, 2 apartment buildings up front and townhouses in behind. Compare those type of developments to, say, the development at the Gore Estate, where we still had single detached homes. So in the future, then, would that mean something like the Gore project would not go forward? It would instead be a number of townhouses or smaller apartment buildings, as opposed to building single detached homes in that sort of infill situation.
So, Madam Mayor, through to Councillor Roman. No, I think each property has to be viewed in its own context. There was discussion once upon a time of looking at medium density housing. It was identified that in the form in which it was originally presented, it would not be appropriate in that context or that setting, and that the single detached was a more appropriate given that setting. It doesn't mean it was right or wrong, but in that context with those variables, it was the more appropriate mix of housing. I mentioned when we talked about the Greenfield development, that's similar to what we did in Cambridge West. If we were to look at the lands west of Swan Street, north of Brant Waterloo Road, we do it at the macro level through a secondary plan. What I would suggest to council is, if options 2 or 3, or some variation of 4, whatever the region at the end of the day ultimately decides, there is going to be intensification. I just can't tell you how much today. But one of my suggestions to council would be, this goes to protection of the neighborhoods. We've already had these discussions at planning and sustainable development, and council saw those draft policies that were designed to direct where the intensification would go and on what terms and what bases. But essentially what you're looking at is creating a corridors and avenues plan. So you would take a look at the Northumberland, Stanley, Swan axes, and you would look almost property by property, what would be appropriate, and you would create a cascade of land use designations with an appropriate mix of land uses. And by policy, you're out in front of it, and you're setting the community expectations. If you remember that draft document that was presented to council, we actually identified to council designating 4 other properties to try and direct some of that intensification growth. Now you would do it on a more macro level, just because notionally are going on for a longer period of time. And where do you want that growth and on what terms? And to Councillor Ostner's earlier comment, there may be a phasing strategy that goes with it. In other words, certain pieces of companion infrastructure or facilities or services are available to support that emerging population or that population profile.
If I may, Councillor Ostner, Councillor Roman, if you recall, the Gore Estates, we questioned at that time how they could be built, and the reason was because the apartment buildings were coming on. They had a higher density that offset the spacing so that the Gore Estates could happen. Seeing no more questions, Councillor Roman, McCreary, you will be reading this, and I'm going to, ask you to read it in its entirety because it's such a big issue. So would you please read the motion?
Moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Roman, the PD report number 2022, or wait a minute, the PD report 22-2022 be received, and the council adopt the following policy directives pertaining to the region's draft land needs assessment of April 2022 and the associated regional official plan review. A, that the Greenfield Mill property located at 3089 Greenfield Road as conceptually identified as parcel A-2 on Schedule 3 attached be included as a minor adjustment to the settlement area of Greenfield. B, the existing air urban area boundary as illustrated on map 2.1 of the Township Official Plan be adjusted as part of a rationalization for the existing settlement boundary to remove 3 parcels totaling approximately 10 hectares of land as conceptually illustrated on schedule attached. C, that the approximate 10 hectares of land identified as part of recommendation 2B above be applied to an adjusted air urban area boundary to include 1056 Swan Street as conceptually identified as parcel 8-1 on Schedule 3 attached. D, that the township supports the objectives of option 2, community area land needs for the 2021 to 2051 time period. E, that as part of the new community area land expansion under option 2 assigned to North Dumfries, that the property identified as 1056 Swan Street as conceptually identified as parcel B-1 on Schedule 3 attached be included in the expanded air urban area boundary. F, that the township supports the objectives of option 1 employment area land needs for the 2021 to 2051 time period. G, that as part of the new employment area land requirements under option 1 assigned to North Dumfries, that the properties identified conceptually as parcels A-1, A-3, and A-4 on Schedule 3 attached be included within the revised employment settlement area boundaries. H, that parcel A-5 and A-6 on Schedule 3 attached be considered as strategic employment areas in the regional official plan for consideration as part of future land use planning exercises. And I, that the region in the 2023 to 2025 time period undertake the preparation of an optimization study in consultation with the township on the air wastewater treatment plant to determine what, if any, operating efficiencies and or capital undertakings could be undertaken to establish additional capacity within the facility. And that staff be directed to provide a copy of this resolution to the region of Waterloo as part of their ongoing analysis and consideration of the draft land use assessment and the associated update of the regional official plan, and that staff, as additional information associated with the land use assessment process is released by the region, provide further reports to council for review and discussion.
All those in favor?
Sorry, Mayor Buxton, can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
So with this motion, the way it is, et cetera, if we adopt option number 2, how are we going to ensure that we're not going to have apartment buildings coming in for applications 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 levels? How are we going to maintain our 4 to 6 max
I was gonna
stores?
talk about
So, Madam Mayor, through to Councillor Oster, it's driven by a number of factors. First of all, we can only generate so much effluent and handle it within the air wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so part of our population modeling assigned to the community of air, we have a hard cap in terms of 3,000 cubic meters per day. So that can be treated and processed through that plant and discharged into the NIF. When we cross over that 3,000 cubic meters per day, we actually cause harmful impact on the assimilative capacity of the NIF and obviously implications on the integrity of that water resource. So one is how much effluent we can generate. Companion to that, as I mentioned, once the region adopts the modeling for all 7 area municipalities, and we understand what our land budget is and our ratio between greenfield versus built urban area boundary, we are obligated to update our official plan. Okay, so working with our planning and sustainable development advisory committee, we actually crafted a series of policies that were designed to protect established neighborhoods by limiting what kind of growth or redevelopment was permitted to maintain the character of those neighborhoods. And we identified opportunities along the Northumberland Swan corridor and adjacent to the downtown. And there we actually talked about, once again, design parameters, density thresholds and the like, so that you didn't have those 6 and 8 story and 10 story type buildings because they'd be out of character. And generally speaking, they were in that 3 to 6 story range where they were identified as appropriate. As I mentioned in my my response to Councillor Rowland a few minutes ago about, how do we protect the vision and integrity of the corporation, of the township going forward? It's through that future planning exercise and creating dynamic policies that look at the macro, where should that growth go, on what terms, and where appropriate and necessary, the phasing scheme or strategy to go with it.
If I may also, I'd like you to look at Burlington. They have created a bylaw that says the apartment building is going to be 4 to 6 stories. And it's the Mayor Marion meets, and I have talked several times on this. And if we could look at something similar to that, so that we put in because you talk about the corridors and everything, and that's good, CO McNeely. But I'm concerned about new subdivisions, like we had the threat of Bruce was going to put a 6 or 8 story apartment building in at some point, and that didn't come to fruition, which is good. But I think we need the safety. If we can get a bylaw or something in our official plan, such as Burlington has, that protects against those high rises, I think that would be wonderful. Something to think about. Anyways, any further questions? Seeing none, I'll call for the motion. All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, and that's carried. Thank you. All right, and can I have the confirmatory bylaw, please? Councillor Rossman?
Moved by myself, second by Councillor Gillespie, that bylaw number 3330-22 being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council on June 6, 2022 be read a first, second, third time and be finally passed, signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk.
All those in favor? And nobody opposed. That's carried. Thank you. And can I have the adjournment, please?
Moved by myself and by Councillor Gillespie that where the business for the special council meeting has been concluded at 8:01 p.m. and be resolved that this meeting adjourns. Meets again on Monday, June 13th at 6 p.m. for committee of the whole.
All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Cynthia, you'll let me know when we're